So I began work on the novel when I finished university, which was 2015. So to get it to this stage has actually been coming up to 6 years now. It doesn't mean that that's been 6 years of constant writing. There's a huge process involved in it. Initially scoping and reading the diary, then getting the diary down on paper and bullet pointing it, and then slowly using it as a hobby to, on the weekends, remove my mind from my day-to-day work. And slowly that formed itself into the novel that it is today. But from start to finish, the moment I picked up the diary to the way it is now, is currently 6 years. It's a really fascinating question because Furze himself is the inspiration. So you could ask the question as, where did the inspiration for the novel come from? And that to me is from my adoration of history and Furze's character himself. When I look through some of these family documents that we all have hidden away in our grandparents' attics, in our parents' basements, I can't help but get enthused by the stories that it relays, especially when you look at the similarities between people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, in what we view as historic, and how that applies to today. I picked up this diary and I didn't have a clue what it meant. I didn't know who Furze was, and I hadn't made the connection between the granddad my mother spoke of and the great-granddad that I had never met. But when you started reading this diary and you picked up on a day in the life of a man from 105 years ago, you realize that although there are vast differences between how they lived and how they acted, there are huge similarities, and in fact greater similarities. And I read this diary page by page, and that first time I did, realized that I hadn't stopped reading for a good couple of hours, and I'd lost myself in this world of love and pain and passion, and also I think questioning the situation you're in, trying to understand why you're there, and once you've accepted that you are there, trying to find your place within that environment. So that's why I was inspired to write the book, is that I will read that diary, I will delve into history, but not everyone has the time or the willpower to do so. For me, it's about presenting that story in a really accessible manner. So initially my family and my friends could read it, but then perhaps other people could gain that same inspiration that I did. A lot of research has gone into writing it. We all through school use the First and Second World War as touch points for our history lessons. It's one of the things that is always in a syllabus, and it's part of our more recent history. I think certainly because of the horrors that were experienced there, the magnitude of it as a war. Certainly wars are not uncommon throughout human history, but this one in particular struck a chord across not only the Europe but the rest of the world in the way it was conducted and the huge numbers of people involved on either side. So I had a little bit of knowledge from that education initially to feed into a book about World War I. What equipment did they use? What situations were they in? Which were the major battles of the time? But the Battle of Festubert, for example, which is the pinnacle of this novel, the midpoint in Furze's 6-month experience that we can recount, I knew very little about. So I looked into the Battle of Festubert. I looked into the fact it was the first major British offensive of World War I, which to me was such an interesting idea that until that point, the UK, Britain, had been on the defensive. It had been trying to stop this advance from the German army, but this was the first time it said, let's try and push back a bit as a major offensive. Other elements were particularly fascinating to me. So in the diary, Furze might say he went to purchase a new revolver. I didn't know what revolvers a British officer might have at his disposal. What did they use? What was the brand? Where did that come from? And all of that took a lot of research. I remember at one point sitting on a balcony with my dad at the time on holiday, and him reading through elements of the book and saying, we need a bit more detail for this scene. Have you actually researched that scene? Did the officers wear helmets, or did they wear berets, or did they wear caps? All of that was really good questions on what did they actually use, and how can we feed that into the novel? As a historical fiction novel, I want it to remain as true to fact as I can, whilst also adding the fictional elements that make it a good and readable story. A lot of my friends and family, when they read the book, wonder whether I've infused myself into Furze, or whether Furze has infused himself into me over the last few years. The terminology within the book, and certainly within the diary, is quite old-fashioned. He uses words that aren't necessarily in use today, like ripping, topping, roaring, and I adore those phrases. I believe I've taken up a great deal of those in the last few years, certainly in the way I express myself and in the way that I use language. Now, to me, that has blurred the lines in who Furze's character is and who my character has been and is now. And that's certainly brought me closer to him, I feel. If you ask me who Furze was, I'm more likely to tell you the character that he portrayed, the morals that he lived up to, as opposed to the actions that he took, even though the actions form a great deal of the diary and therefore of the book. And so because of that, I feel that I do know him as opposed to the history of him. And certainly my mum, who did know him, even though I never met him, is amazed at how well his character and his voice has been captured. And she will recount herself that if you read the novel and read the way in which these sentences are drafted, the events are spoken of, it sounds as if he's recounting them himself. Now, in large part, that's because his diary is so detailed and it's so particular, and he had such a method of speaking and characterizing events. But I also feel that both myself and him have developed characters through this 5 to 6 year process. The book has been a large task to undertake. The most difficult element of it thus far has been editing the work, which was something that I didn't foresee being so challenging, purely because when you put your ideas on paper, especially something as personal as a novel that uses a character you know existed, wondering which elements to cut, which parts of history not to include, which characters won't form a part of the novel, has been really hard. Every time I read this book, there are sections of it that will draw a tear to my eye, and I will, no matter how many times I relay the story or read it or recount it, I will always well up a little bit at certain moments. And the reason for that is that you are dealing with real people. They may not exist anymore, but at some point they did. And those people touched the lives of the other characters that are named not only within the diary and the novel, but other characters that aren't named. The hard part for me was making sure that I did justice to those memories contained in the pages. Because when you read about Fuller, when you read about Brooks, all of these friends of Furze, you know that you're relaying someone who was real. And trying to weave fiction into that reality is where I, as an author, feel my greatest responsibility. And therefore, that's the element that I could find most difficult and I could potentially find most challenging. The added weight, however, is what makes that so magnificent. So although that was the hardest part to balance and to get right, it was the most rewarding. Because when you see a full character at the end, where fiction and fact has infused so perfectly that you can see a character developing and you feel an affinity to it, that's the aim. Now, I can't say I've got there, but that's what I've got in the back of my mind when you have a simple word on a page written in pencil 105 years ago, and that single word represents an entire life, and you've got to bring that to your readers. I adore books. I adore novels. And throughout my life, I've tried to read a broad spread of different genres and authors themselves. There are a couple, however, that have really influenced me. The first is Dostoevsky, a Russian author who's very famous for writing enormous books dealing with incredibly intense philosophical topics. But he does so on some of the most apparently mundane aspects of life. So a lot of the time, people will look at a philosophical novel or an enormous tome and think it must deal with something complex because it appears so complex. But an example I'll give you is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And it deals with three brothers and the lives they lead. The military brother, the successful business brother, and the priestly religious brother. But not in a way that he goes to the church and joins the priesthood and that's it with his life. It's the morality behind them. Their overbearing father, who is hoarding all his wealth while his sons go off and give their lives to their chosen professions, whilst each one of them feels to the other like they're being more of a success, but internally they're questioning their own being. Why are they here? What's the purpose of it? And these are fundamental questions. One aspect of Dostoevsky that I most adore is that he could describe a teacup in a way that would make that teacup the most important, the most interesting, and the most intricate moment in that novel. And you will be captivated by the way that he will describe something so simple. And that's something which I wish to attempt and wish to emulate in the novels that I write. The details that most people overlook are actually the details that give life its most vibrant colour. And then add that to another author who I absolutely adore, Oscar Wilde, best known for his poetry. But the one novel that he did write, The Picture of Dorian Gray, is my favourite novel. Made so because it is beautifully constructed. The words are passionately written. They are evocative. They weave colour into every page of that book. And they deal with quite mischievous characters. Dorian Gray himself, this youthful persona coming into the British society and trying to retain that youth at almost any cost, and only at the very end realizing that youth itself is not what's important. It's how you apply that youth that is of the greatest value. But what Oscar Wilde does is bring his poetic background into a novel and say, isn't that what life's about? Asking again these fantastic questions on how we are to live, not the length of time that we live, but how we actually apply ourselves. So those two authors give you quite a sense of where I wish to take my own writing. It's the intricacy with which Dostoevsky applies himself to the most mundane of activities, which draws you into their reality and importance, and the poetic nature of Oscar Wilde's application and character, again, of perhaps questions that we overlook every day, but which inevitably we have in the back of our minds in every single aspect of our lives.
If you enjoyed the video and would like to watch more, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. Also, please see the description box below for a link to our website and other social media platforms.